Hello, class. Welcome to another edition of Adolescent Psychology on video, I guess, right? We're going to do this independent study thing, and today, this lesson is pretty darn important because it begins to tie together a bunch of things. But to understand what's going on now, we got to go back in time. So we're going to look at some historical perspectives on adolescence, and let's get going. So it says the following information is heavily summarized to give a general overview. What I'm going to be doing in this lesson is going through some examples. They're not perfect examples. They're merely meant to illustrate the concepts that I'm going to be talking about. All right. They are not literally, they're not meant to be taken as literally historically accurate. We're going to look at some things, and most of this is going to be from a Eurocentric perspective. A lot of the stuff I talk about, though, it does span across to other cultures. So let's get diving into it, I guess, right? First of all, adolescence changed. It changed from the way it used to be back when the rite of passage granted adulthood, and we spent time covering that and how that all worked. But it changed. It's not the same now. Why did it change? To understand how we arrived at the life condition adolescents face today, we must examine the past. Why did the rite of passage lose its meaning today compared to many generations ago? The answer is in the past. Let's go digging and see what we can find. So life 500 years ago. I could say 500 years ago. In some areas, I could say 100 years ago or 150 years ago, maybe. I could also say 5,000 years ago, because life really, really hadn't changed all that much. Not really. So, I would say life in Egypt 6,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, was really not all that different than life in the Middle Ages in Europe. I don't think it was all that different. Day-to-day life for common people was a struggle, and for many of us, it still is. Let's take a look at this. First thing, lifespan today. How long do we live today? Well, women live to be 80, men live to be 78. I'm going to avoid that. 500 years ago, though, how long did people live? 40 to 50, somewhere in there, which sadly is not much lower than current life expectancy on Pine Ridge. How do we know 40 to 50? You hear this, you see it a lot of places. I had to go look it up. I needed to see the evidence myself. And what I discovered is church records. More importantly, baptismal and burial records in churches in Europe 500 years ago. If you have a baptismal record and a record of when they were buried, you've got their age, and the average age 40 to 50, right? And you know how averages work. Lots of children died from different diseases. You weren't normally going to live much past 40 or 50. If you made it to 50, maybe you might see 65 or 70, maybe, because you'd already overcome so many obstacles. But getting to age 10 or 12 was probably one of the biggest hurdles. So, why? Poor medical knowledge and practices. 500 years ago, if you had a fever and you went to, well, you didn't go to the doctor, you went to the barber, they were likely to cut you and bleed you to get the evil spirits out. True story. You can look that up on your time. So poor medical knowledge and practices. Poor hygiene, like literally. The cities 500 years ago were absolutely disgusting. Go back even longer, more like 800 years ago, to when the Black Plague ravaged Europe. And this was a hygiene thing, right? Rats everywhere, spreading that disease. And we can back up to poor medical knowledge. They didn't understand the way disease was spread, that they didn't understand germs. They didn't understand virus and bacteria. They had no knowledge of it. They attributed sickness to something else. Well, poor hygiene was one of those things that was contributing to their own illnesses, and they didn't realize it. I'm going to give you an example of poor hygiene. June was the preferred month to get married. The preferred month to get married. And the reason for that is that it had finally warmed up enough to have your annual bath. I said annual. Annual bath. To have a bath was a tremendous amount of work, right? And so to get married in June meant that you had just recently had a bath, so odds are you still smell pretty good, right? And also, the way the bath worked. You're talking about a male patriarchy in terms of general culture, particularly in Europe. If there was going to be a bath, the whole family took a bath, but not together. Dad went first, then mom, then the oldest kid, and it went down the line till you got to the baby. I mean, who would want to bathe the baby in that wretched same bathwater, the same bathwater, right? And there's the phrase, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because they were the last one to get a bath. And that goes back to medieval times. Poor hygiene. Going to the bathroom, for crying out loud. If you've never heard of a chamber pot, you would pee in this chamber pot at night. And then in the morning, you have to imagine in a city, in the morning you'd wake up and the birds would be chirping, the sun would be shining in, you'd open your windows on the second floor and you'd fling the contents of your chamber pot out into the street below. Common practice. The streets today are have a hump in the middle so that it drains off to the side. Streets then were like this. They had a gutter down the middle of the street that was filled with everyone's urine and feces, and from all the animals also. So there was this steady stream of absolute putrid filth flowing down the middle of streets. Poor hygiene, right? In this case, poor public hygiene, you could say. The toilet changed a lot of that. Indoor plumbing changed a lot of that. Those advances had a tremendous effect on hygiene, right? By the way, inventor of the toilet, actually not the inventor, but the guy who modified the invention to where it was practical, Thomas Crapper. True story. Look it up on your time. Next item. Poor or inconsistent food supply. Too many today take food for granted. I mean, you're inconvenienced if you go to the grocery store and they don't have potatoes for some crazy reason, Oh, now I have to go to Walmart for potatoes. Um, what an inconvenience, right? Well, back then, there were no guarantees. It wasn't like you had another place to go. Odds are you raised your own food. You had to rely on yourself to feed yourself. So if crops failed, people died. Potato famine, Ireland, 1850s in there. Um, I forget the exact year. I want to say 1853 maybe was the peak of it. Potato famine, what happened? The potatoes got some kind of fungus that just caused them to rot in the ground before they could even be harvested. They were worthless. You couldn't eat them. The result? 1 million people died. 1 million more left Ireland. A lot of them came to the US, where they were treated like garbage. People hated the Irish, the latest group of immigrants, right? My time out in California, teaching to Hispanic students, I would mention this, and they could relate. They definitely could relate, because now they're the latest group of immigrants under the gun, so to speak. Um, well, the whole thing here is poor or inconsistent food supply led to death that we don't see today normally, not in this country anyway. Let's keep going. What else changed? Identity. Your work was a major part of your identity, and you see this in European names. Names came directly from jobs. Here's some examples on the slide. Baker, cook, shoemaker, literally shoemaker in German, right? Which what does that mean for me? It means somewhere back in my past, back with ancestors in Germany, somebody made shoes. Someone did. Smith, someone who someone who makes things. A blacksmith makes iron, things made of iron. A silversmith, for example, makes silverware, silver jewelry. A wright is someone who fixes things. A mason, masons build things with stone or brick. Hunter, fisher, fletcher. I don't know if you guys know what a fletcher is. Fletcher is someone who makes arrows. They put the fletchings on the shaft of the arrow. So let me sit up a little higher here. Knight, farmer, miller. A miller, no, they don't make beer. A miller grinds grain to make flour, which he would probably then sell to the baker, right? A sawyer, a sawmill, they cut down trees. A different name for a lumberjack, perhaps you could say. Look at sawyer and think of lawyer, a lawyer, right? They deal with the law. Sawyer, they deal with saws and trees and wood. The key thing is they took on the name of the job they did, right? You didn't say, go see the baker. You said, go see Baker. You need bread, go see Baker. It became his name. There was an absolute blending of who you were with what you did. It's kind of a cool thing, the history of names. I wish I knew more about Lakota naming and exactly how all of that works. I would like to hear some of that. Let's keep going. Home and work were the same. You lived where you worked and you worked where you lived. There was no work and home. There was only life. If you were a baker, You got up in the morning. You went in the next room where the ovens were and you began to prepare dough to make bread. You lived where you worked. You worked where you lived. There was no difference. There was no separation there, right? You just lived. You just lived. I think Lakota on the plains 150 to 200 years ago plus, that's what they did. They didn't consider things work or leisure. It was simply life. You simply lived your life. Continuing. How you got a job. Oh boy. This is going to be really about males. Why? Again, male dominated society. Females did as they were told. I got to tell you, I had fun telling middle schoolers this information in a little different format, but essentially the same information. The girls in class would go crazy. Oh, hell no, no. And I would say, isn't it nice to be living today compared to back then? And they all agreed. And I agree too. Mostly. So getting a job, we're going to talk about what males needed to do. One of the things they could do is an apprenticeship. You'd be trained by a highly skilled master craftsman. This was rare and hard to get. Why? Because the master craftsmen had their own kids that they would take on as apprentices and train, right? So if you had a son and he was 7 years old, let's say 6 years old, and a mason happened to come by, which would be a really excellent craftsman, skilled craftsman, and he said, I'm looking for an apprentice. I see your son looks to be about the age that I would take one on if you're willing. This was like hitting the lottery. This was like winning the jackpot to have a master craftsman say that he would agree to train your son as an apprentice to become a mason. He would never be out of work his entire life, ever. That's why this was like winning the jackpot. And you would send your 7-year-old son off with that person. What's life going to be like for your 7-year-old son? They're essentially going to be a slave to that master craftsman and do everything that they're told to do. And if they rebel and they don't want to, they don't like it, master craftsman will cut them loose. Say, you don't want this skill? Get out of here. Go back home. Even at age 7 or 8 or so, kids knew and understood the importance of doing as they were told in this situation and following what the apprentice says. How else would you get a job? Number one most common way, you got dad's job. And dad started training you from 1.5 years old. As soon as you could walk and talk, you were training. Only it didn't feel like training to you. It felt like play. If you were being trained by dad to take his job, if this was like playing with dad, if dad was a baker, maybe you would wake up and he's already in the bakery part of the home, and he's working on dough, and you come in and he looks over at you, and he cuts off a little piece of dough and says, "Here, make a loaf, and we'll bake it." And you get all excited, and you watch him making a loaf. He says, "Just watch how I do this," and then you do it with that piece. You're excited. You get to be just like dad. What an awesome deal. So you work on it, and as you do, he says, no, this is wrong. You got to fix it and do it more like this. Okay, dad, sure. You want to be just like dad. And it feels awesome to have dad recognize you like this, right? You're being trained. It might feel like play, but you're being trained. We still kind of have this today, by the way. The little Fisher-Price toolbox, right? With the little plastic Fisher-Price tools. Maybe Junior today sees Dad out in the driveway changing the oil in the car. So Junior takes his little Fisher-Price toolbox out and he lines up his Hot Wheel or Big Wheel or whatever, and he pretends to work on his big wheel while Dad's working on it. He wants to be just like Dad. And I mean, that's the whole point of the Fisher-Price plastic tools. It's to emulate what the dad does. Oh, and yeah, I know. There's a gender thing there too, right? I was in Walmart the other day and I had to look. There is an aisle of toys that is mostly black. Everything is black. It's all black plastic, it seems like. And then there's an aisle of toys where it looks like somebody puked pink all over the place. Gender training is ingrained in our culture. It is what it is. I can't stop it. You can't stop it. But I would encourage you that if your daughter wants to play with tools instead of Barbies, good Lord, let her. And vice versa. Who cares? They've got some time when they're that young to figure out who they are, since we're talking about identity, right? So you had to train from when you were 1.5 years old or so, as soon as you could walk and talk. And important. Oops, next slide. Important. There we go. You must learn Dad's job by the time you have your rite of passage. You must. Why? Dad's age at your birth. Well, apparently I'm getting a notice. I don't know if that popped up on a video or not. Dad's age at your birth, 26. Okay. Your age at your rite of passage, 14. Okay. Dad's age at your rite of passage, 40. Dad's nearing the end of his life. You have to learn everything Dad knows about being a baker in this instance. You better know it all. You better have it all down. If you don't, it puts you seriously at risk. This is a matter of life and death. It's a matter of survival. You had to know Dad's job. If Dad died early, if Dad died 10 years earlier, when you were, what, 4, 5? Your entire family's survival is in doubt. Certainly, Mom is gonna jump into that role, but it's at the expense of the things that she did within the family. So everything gets tougher. Everything gets tougher. It's far better that you learn Dad's job by the time you hit your rite of passage. Now, if Dad's still around when he's 40, maybe he's got 10 years in him. Maybe he can go 20. Who knows? But what we do know from history is you can't count on it. You can't bank on it. Odds are every year after 40 is like borrowed time. All right. This is really cool, and I alluded to this earlier. This way of life was stable for thousands of years. Really, since civilization started, there was a division of labor and a specialization of labor. And within those specializations, people became very highly skilled at what they did. They learned a lot because they could specialize, and they passed those skills on to the next generation. It was like that way for thousands of years. It really didn't change all that much, especially for not the ruling class, but the lower, the working class. We'll move on. So what changed? And the answer is in parentheses. The Industrial Revolution changed everything. Let's take a look at this. What was the Industrial Revolution? That was using machinery to produce products instead of master craftsmen. What they discovered is they could produce machines that produced parts that could be assembled by anyone. And in that way, you didn't have to learn these intense skills to be able to produce things. George Washington example. All right, and this example is kind of that notice at the beginning of this PowerPoint. The example is that it's not to be taken literally and exactly. It is loosely based on events around George Washington at the time of the American Revolution, getting independence from England. So, what happened? George Washington inherited a mess. He had scattered militias all over the place. He didn't really have an army to speak of. It was small. They were poorly armed, and he had a problem. He needed guns. Right? So the way the story goes, and this is the story part of it, the historical fiction, I guess, if you want to call it that. There's George Washington sitting in camp, mulling over his options, which were few, and these two guys ride up. And they stop and they go, "Yo, you George?" He says, "Yeah." "Yo, we've been looking for you. We got a deal for you." And he's like, "What do these guys want? What are they doing?" And they say, "Well, we heard you need some guns." He goes, "Well, yes, to supply my army, I need many arms. Many." He goes, "Well, how about we sell you some?" He goes, "Oh, well, I'll buy all that you have. Go ahead and see the paymaster and take the guns over to the armory." He goes, No, you're getting ahead of yourself, George. Here, now listen, we're gonna make a deal here." And they tell him, "Tell you what, 1 year from now, give us 1 year. We'll bring back, say, 10,000 guns." George Washington's mouth fell open and his wooden teeth fell out and chattered around on the table. No, they didn't. What happened was he immediately thought, "Oh, these guys are crazy. They're just trying to get money from me." And he says, "Okay, you stop back in a year and I'll buy whatever guns you have. You have 10,000 guns, I'll pay you for them." He goes, "All right, then we got a deal." And away they rode, right? So off they rode. Well, George Washington knew that for them to make 10,000 guns, one gunsmith could make about 10 guns a year. They would need, of course, 1,000 gunsmiths working for them to produce 10,000 guns in that year. Well, in all the 13 colonies, there might only be 1,000 gunsmiths. So he said, "They're crazy. It's impossible. They can't do it." What they had figured out, though, is they didn't need 1,000 gunsmiths. They come back a year later, and when they come back, they got this. They're in a wagon, and they've got a great big crate on the back of the wagon, and they ride up to George. They find him at his camp, wherever he was, and they say, "George, hey, we're back. We brought you something." And he goes, I remember you. You too? That's right. You were going to bring me 10,000 guns. I'm ready. What do you have?" "Well, we don't quite have 10,000 guns. We got one." And George Washington rolls his eyes, but he reaches over one of these guys, and he pulls this gun out, and it is unlike anything George Washington has seen. And he takes it over, hands it to George, and George, holds it up, and he looks down the barrel through the sights. He says, "Well, this is a fine weapon. This is great. How many more do you have?" "Well, we only got the one." Goes, "But check this out." And the guy goes back to the box, and he gets a screwdriver. And he goes over and he takes two screws out of the bottom of the gun, and he pulls the trigger right out of the gun. The whole trigger assembly comes out. And he goes over to the box, grabs another trigger assembly, slips it into place, puts the two screws in, cocks it, pulls the trigger, and it works. That's impossible. No guns were made like that. No guns were. How were they able to do that? Because in that time, a skilled craftsman, a gunsmith, made guns from scratch by hand. Every single piece made by a gunsmith, and each individual gun was unique to itself. Certainly, there were design characteristics that were highly similar, but every gun was very, very much its own creation. If it broke, you had to take it back to that. I've got a visitor here. My dog just came in. You had to take it back to that gunsmith. So, George Washington looks at it and he's in awe. "Well, that's amazing." He goes, "It gets better." He takes out another screw, pops the barrel off, goes over to the box, pulls another barrel out, comes over, puts the barrel on, puts the screw in. It's ready to go. George Washington could see the immediate benefits to this. And he worked with the Continental Congress to create Springfield Armory. If you've heard of a Springfield gun, that's to this day, that's the namesake of this creation in the 1780s, 70s, I guess, of George Washington and the Continental Congress and some early industrialists. They learned to make machines that made parts of products instead of making the whole product themselves, right? By skilled craftsmen. Then anyone could put the product together. So, one gunsmith, 10 guns a year, 1,000 gunsmith, 10,000 guns per year. Now, one factory with 100 workers equals 10,000 guns per year. What a huge difference. What a huge difference, right? One factory with 100 workers equals 10,000 guns per year. Why was that a big difference? Well, how many unemployed gunsmiths were there? Because those 1,000 gunsmiths before, they were making just the right amount of guns. Supply met demand. There wasn't too many guns, there wasn't a shortage. It was just right. So now how many unemployed gunsmiths are there? If 100 workers could replace the effort and work of 1,000, how about 900? So, here's what that meant. Imagine you're a gunsmith, right? And you just had your rite of passage a year and a half ago, and this past winter your father died. But he lived to be 41. He had a full life. And there you are, 15 years old, and you're a gunsmith, and you know what? You've got skills. You can make a pretty darn good gun. You really can. The guns you make, you're able to sell each one as you make them. And every so often, somebody brings one in that maybe you made or maybe your father made. And you know exactly, you probably worked on that gun, whether it was you or your dad. And you know exactly how to fix it, and you can get it fixed, and get it back to that customer. Um, except someone opens the gun factory down the street. Well, the gun factory produces guns that are better than yours. They're more accurate. They're easier to fix. Replacement parts are easily obtainable. In fact, the owner can usually fix it themselves. Suddenly, everyone wants this new, better product, which, by the way, it costs less than your gun. Here you are trying to sell a gun for $9.95. I mean, $9.95. And the gun factory is selling one that's a lot better for $7.50. Well, you find all of a sudden that nobody wants your guns. Well, you've worked hard for 6 weeks to make one. You haven't sold the previous one. Now you have two brand new guns sitting on the shelf. You can't get rid of them. What are you going to do? Now you don't have money coming in. You need that money literally to survive. Literally to survive. And now it's not coming in. Well, you decide after 3 months, and I mean, you're getting skinnier. You're not eating. Your family is suffering because it fell upon you to take care of everyone. You decide, you know what? I'm going to go get a job at the gun factory. So you go to the gun factory, and there's the factory owner, and the factory owner says, "What do you want?" And you say, "Well, I brought my finest gun in. I wanted you to see what I can do, and I would love to come work for you and put these skills to use." And the factory owner looks at it and says, "Well, this is a great weapon. You should be proud of yourself. You did a great job with this." And just as he's looking at it, someone else walks in the door from the next village, another gunsmith. Only instead of 15, this gunsmith is 21. He's got 6 more years experience than you. And he comes in and says the same thing. "Hello, sir. I'd like to work in your gun factory. Take a look at what I can do." And his gun is looking pretty good. He's got a rifle that is incredible. And the factory owner looks at it and is like, "Oh, this is wonderful. We could incorporate some of this into the gun that I'm making. This is awesome." And then he looks back at you, the 15-year-old gunsmith, and he says, "I'm sorry, young man, I can't use you. Here's your weapon back. You did a good job with it. Good luck to you. And good day, sir." The 21-year-old gets the job. Well, the 21-year-old begins work. He's out on the factory floor, and he's working one day, and factory owners in those early days, they were the most horrible, greedy people on the face of the earth. And they didn't want to heat the factory much more than they had to. So it was cold. And so this 21-year-old gunsmith, now a gun factory worker, is working in this cold factory. He's got his coat on, and one of the machine jams up a little bit. So he goes to clear the machinery, and his coat gets grabbed by a gear and pulls him in, and the gearing of the machinery rips his arm right off. The factory owner is up in his second floor office looking over the factory floor, and he sees that and he screams, "Oh my God, Get him out of my factory. He's bleeding all over everything. So that people take him outside, and he sits outside and bleeds to death and freezes to death. Well, there's you, the 15-year-old gunsmith. You hear what happened, and you think, oh, job opening. So you go back down, and you had just turned 16 by now, and you go back down to the factory, and you walk in the door, and just as you walk in, someone follows you behind. Another 16-year-old gunsmith from the village in the opposite direction. Well, he comes in, and he's got his rifle, and you brought another one that you made that you still can't sell, and you're both 16. You both have equivalent rifles. They're excellent rifles. They show the skill that you developed, that you were trained by Dad to do. And the factory owner looks at both of your weapons, and he says, "Why should I hire either one of you?" And you say, "Well, sir, I've already proven to you I've been here before, and I've shown my interest, and I want this job." And the other person says, "Well, I want this job too." And the other person says, "And I can read and write and do some mathematics." Well, the factory owner immediately turns to the other person and says, "Really? Read this," and hands him a schematic, a diagram for how to build the rifle in the factory. And he starts reading off the technical details flawlessly. And then he takes the paper back and he hands it to you, and he says, "Go ahead and read this." And you're like, "Sir, I can't read. I was never taught to read." He says, "I'm sorry. I have a much greater need for someone who can read and write and do some math than I do someone who is illiterate. Here's your weapon. Good day to you, sir." And out the door you go, unemployed and still very hungry. Well, your hunger persists. And a few weeks later, you come back to that factory, and you walk in the door, and the factory owner sees you and says, "What do you want here? I told you I don't have a job for you." And you get down on your knees and you beg, "Please, please, I'll take any job you have, anything." And he says, "Well, you're not getting stepping foot on my factory floor. I've got plenty of experience, much more experienced people." And he says, "I'll do anything, anything." Factory owner thinks about it for a second, kind of takes a little bit of pity on you. And he says, "Well, I just built some stables, and I've got lots of horses now, and I do need someone to go out there and feed horses and shovel horse crap." And you're like, "Yes, yes, I'll do it, I'll do it, I'll do it." That's the birth of young people being excluded from the workplace. He no longer could take on a professional position. He was limited, literally, to crappy jobs. Literally. So this is a change. This is a dramatic change from just a few generations earlier. Now, of course, it didn't go down just like this. I said that this is an illustration. It's a dramatic example. Those processes that I talked about happened over 150 years or so, roughly, from the late 1700s through to 1920 or so, somewhere in there, 1930, we could say. Definitely by the end of World War II, it had radically changed. What happened? Only older and more experienced workers are hired. Now, I know initially in the Industrial Revolution, little children were working in factories. And there's a horrible horrible story there to be told of kids losing their fingers and hands in looms, industrial looms to make fabric, um, things like that. Kids were used all the time. But as those early industrialists began to realize they needed workers who could read and write. And what was the value? Well, for our gun factory owner, he could write up changes in the gun design, hand it to that person, and that person could read those changes, adjust the machinery as needed, and now the factory owner is making more money, right? So for the first time, academic skills became a requirement by the end of that changeover to the Industrial Revolution. It really became a requirement. The response was this: the birth of modern education and school becoming mandatory. The whole education system was built upon the need for factory workers to have reading and writing skills. We should say the need of factory owners to have workers that had those skills. So our modern public education system was designed to create literate factory workers in the Industrial Revolution. The video, if you can watch it, the video to Pink Floyd, I believe, "We Don't Need No Education." Watch the video, and you see some really old school education techniques. It's called the Lancasterian System, where kids are treated like little robots. And I think a lot of kids, a lot of adolescents feel that way to this day about school. In fact, maybe you guys felt that way. I know I definitely had my days where I felt like I don't need this. We don't need no education, right? So school became mandatory. I don't know if I have another. No, that's the end of the slideshow for today. So I'm going to end this. This is part one. We got part two. I won't be quite as long-winded, and maybe we'll get through it a little bit quicker for part two. I'll have a little bit of writing for you regarding this video. So once you're done with this, you can replay it, go back to different spots to engage whatever you need to do for your writing. And as always, if you have questions, if you have comments, if you need help, please fire an email to me. I've been checking it every day or two, mostly every day. I will look at it. So fire me an email if you don't get something, you don't understand, or you need extra guidance or help. I'll do what I can to get you on track, and that ought to do it. Okay, awesome. Thanks for sticking with the video. And I will catch you next week with another video, part two of this. All right? We're going to look at how adolescence became what it is today because of all these changes. Okay, that's it. See you later. Bye.